Book of Habakkuk chapter 2. This chapter consists of 4 parts. In the first part, we see Habakkuk waiting for God, and this we find in verse 1. He is waiting for God to answer his questions, with which he ends in chapter 1. And he mentioned the place where he is waiting, and his condition while waiting. The place is a watchtower, for he is anticipating God's reply. And a bulwark, where he enjoys feeling safe, till God intervenes. And he chose to portray the state of his waiting as standing, stationing himself and keeping watching. Not lying pessimistic or defeated. Because he is confident that God will answer him. And as he knows that God is talkative, so he says, "To see what he will say to me." The second part, from verse 2 to 4. Indeed, we find God speaking, and rewarding the faith of Habakkuk. And this is what Habakkuk appreciated when he said, "Then the Lord answered me." And the Lord's answer was, "Write down the vision and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it." Which means, write it clearly, so that everyone can read and understand it. Even if he was running, he can understand and proclaim it. But the Lord was clear with Habakkuk and told him, "The vision is yet for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false." And until it was fulfilled, and though it delayed, Habakkuk had to wait for it. For it will certainly come and will not delay. During the waiting period, we find a different reaction from 2 groups. The first group is the wicked one is misusing God's long-suffering, so he is puffed up and his soul is not right within him. As for the second group, we find the righteous one, who is given here a valuable advice. He must use his faith in order to be able to endure the waiting period successfully. For, the righteous will live by his faith. Then God moves on to describe the evil of Babylon in the third part, which we find in verse 5. And he says that Babylon is deceived. It is like a man who was drunk and betrayed by wine. He gives 2 descriptions of this man. The first is that he is arrogant and never at rest. Because he is like a drunk man, he is not aware of his true size. But in his greed, he enlarges his soul like Sheol. In the second description, he resembles death, for he is never satisfied. But continues to gather to himself all the nations. That prompted God to announce his judgment on Babylon. We can find it in the 4th and final part. Where the oppressed nations speak 5 woes that Babylon will suffer. In every woe, Babylon's sin is exposed and the punishment it deserves are explained. The first woe. Due to the plundering and oppression of Babylon. Woe to the one who increases what is not his. Woe to him who makes himself rich with debts. Who plundered many nations. And the problem is that human blood has been shed, and violence done to the people. But this situation will not last long. As creditors will suddenly arise and take their rights from Babylon once again. So nations will plunder Babylon, as it plundered them before. The second woe is caused by evil gain. Babylon is portrayed as the one who uses deceit in order to ensure safety for himself. So he plotted the ruin of many peoples. But as much as he thought the plot would succeed him, he discovered that the plot had brought him disgrace. As he is the one who would pay for all of this at the end. That resulted in shaming his own house, forfeiting his life. And the stone and wood that he took from other nations to build his own house with, will testify against him. The third woe speaks of cruelty and violence. Because they built cities at the expense of the blood of peoples they enslaved. The Lord is not satisfied and will interfere with his judgment. So, instead of glory which should become the share of Babylon due to their great cities built, the Lord Almighty determined that they exhausted themselves for vanity. All these labors is only fuel for the fire. And we will find that the Lord is the one who is glorified. For the day will come, when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. The fourth woe, its subject is drunkenness and defilement. Babylon is pictured as a man who makes a woman drink wine to gain control of her. So Babylon gives drink to her neighbors, so that she can gaze on their nakedness. But God intervened and declared woe. And in this woe God himself is the one who will give Babylon to drink, not just wine, but from the cup of the Lord's right hand. Then it's Babylon's turn to be exposed. As we come to the last woe, which is caused by idolatry, we find a description of the idol in 3 words: speechless, dumb, and no breath in it. And the first thing he talked about was speechless. Because that is what Habakkuk needed the most, for God to speak to him and answer him. Which idols cannot do for those who turn to them. Here he comes to a logical conclusion. An idol maker is actually more powerful than the idol itself. So, it does not benefit him when he relies on it. Indeed, our problem now is not literal idolatry. But Paul says that covetous man is an idolater. Ephesians 5 verse 5. Because it allows inanimate object to control his thoughts and priorities. The chapter ends with a beautiful paradox between the real, living God, and idols that have no value or benefit. As for the Lord, he is in his holy temple. He took his place, and when he speaks judgment, the whole earth shall be silent before him.